It wasn't the cow in the middle of Highway 46 that shocked Grace the most, it was the man beside it, wearing nothing but cowboy boots and a sheriff's hat, pointing a pistol at their rental car like it had insulted his mother. Somewhere behind her, Joyce was yelling something about an unpaid parking ticket in Fresno from 1982, while Martha, cool as a cucumber, reached slowly for her wine thermos like this sort of thing happened every Tuesday. The engine was running, the cow was mooing, and time had the decency to slow down just long enough for one horrifying realization to sink in. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. And the worst part was, it wouldn't be the last. But before we begin, write in the comments where you're from, I'm curious to see how far these stories can travel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new captivating tales. Let's begin. 3 weeks earlier, the idea had been as innocent as it was ridiculous, a simple wine tour through California's Central Coast, just the three of them, no men, no rules, no regrets. They met every Wednesday at the community center in Glendale for Scrabble, strong coffee, and stronger opinions, but this time Grace arrived late, face pale, wedding ring gone, voice shaking like an old screen door in a summer storm. She dropped into the chair across from Joyce and Martha like her knees had betrayed her. I found his letters, Grace said, barely above a whisper, but with the force of a church bell hitting noon. Martha didn't flinch, she'd seen 1,000 stories in her years of protests and picket lines, but this one carried a quieter fury. Joyce, who once sold million-dollar homes to millionaires who couldn't find their own kitchen, reached across the table and touched Grace's hand without saying a word. He was writing her, for 30 years, Grace said, eyes darting like a woman still waiting to wake up. 30 years, and I never had a clue. The silence that followed was deep and respectful, the kind old women offer when words feel too small to hold the weight of a shattered life. It was Martha who broke it. Well, hell, she said, standing up. Then we better go find ourselves a damn good bottle of wine. They left Glendale the next Monday in a rented silver Toyota Highlander with a GPS that still believed Nixon was president. Joyce had a binder filled with printouts from TripAdvisor and hand-scribbled notes from friends who'd done similar resets, as they called it, like grief was a sweater you could take off and leave at a vineyard. Martha brought a duffel bag full of protest shirts she hadn't worn since Reagan, and Grace packed light, just enough to feel like she wasn't running away, even though she was. Their first stop was Paso Robles, the kind of sleepy town where wine pours freely, and no one cares if you order it before noon. They spent the morning sipping Cabernets, the afternoon learning how to pronounce Viognier, and the evening in a B&B run by a woman named Sandy who talked like Oprah and cooked like Julia Child. That night, after one glass too many and a moon that hung too close to the earth, Joyce wandered out onto the porch and looked out over the vineyard. She hadn't said much about her husband, not since he passed 3 years ago, taking half her breath with him and leaving the other half to pay bills and fill out paperwork. But that night, watching the moonlight silver the leaves, she said softly to no one in particular, "It's strange, isn't it? How a life can get so quiet you forget you used to laugh." Inside, Martha was watching reruns of Murder, She Wrote and yelling at Angela Lansbury like they were old war buddies. Grace was asleep on the couch, mouth open, one slipper missing. It was all so ridiculous and so achingly real that Joyce laughed out loud, deep, loud, a belly laugh that startled the night birds and felt like medicine. The next day they stopped at a roadside farmer's market to stretch their legs and ended up on a goat farm owned by a woman named Ruby who wore overalls and smelled like fresh hay and unfiltered opinions. Ruby offered them a tour and a shot of something she called barn whiskey, which turned out to be peach schnapps distilled in a shed behind her trailer. Grace coughed so hard she nearly lost her dentures, but Joyce kept sipping and Martha started talking politics with Ruby, who was somehow both a libertarian and a vegan. Then came the cow. They'd only made it a few miles down the road when the Highlander swerved around a bend and came face to face with a full-grown Holstein, standing defiantly in the middle of the highway like it had a mortgage to pay. Joyce hit the brakes, Grace screamed, and Martha rolled down her window and yelled, "Move, you magnificent beast, we have a tasting at 2. That's when the man appeared. No shirt. Cowboy boots. Sheriff's hat. A pistol in one hand and a look in his eyes that said he hadn't spoken to another human being since the Bush administration. "You ladies lost?" he asked, voice low, thick, southern tinted but California cooked. Joyce raised both hands. "Sir, we are exactly where we meant to be. Except for the cow. The cow is optional." He didn't smile. Didn't move. Just motioned for them to pull over. They obeyed. Slowly. Silently. Grace muttered something about her well-being in the glove box. Once they were out of the car, the man holstered his pistol and pulled out a notebook, the kind real cops use when they want to look busy. "You ladies got a permit to transport controlled liquids across county lines?" Martha blinked. "You mean the wine?" He squinted. "Wine, moonshine, pickled peaches, I don't make the rules, ma'am, I just enforce them." "What law school did you graduate from?" Martha snapped, arms crossed. That was when a second car pulled up behind them, an actual police cruiser this time, complete with sirens, and a very confused-looking deputy who stepped out, took one look at the scene, and said, "Oh, Jesus, Roy, are you harassing tourists again?" Roy tipped his hat. "Just trying to keep the roads safe." The deputy rolled his eyes, apologized, and waved the women on their way, muttering something about retired volunteers getting too much sun. Back in the car, Grace was shaking with laughter, Joyce was already planning how to write the Yelp review, and Martha just muttered, "Men." They made it to the tasting just before sunset. The vineyard was called El Cielo, perched high on a hill that caught the last golden light like a secret. The winemaker was waiting, tall, weathered, eyes like oak leaves and hands that looked like they'd held both grapes and grief. His name was Raphael. And before that sun went down, one of them would fall for him in a way that neither age nor common sense could explain. But that would come after the next glass. It was the kind of vineyard that didn't advertise, didn't host weddings, and didn't have a gift shop filled with scented candles and souvenir corkscrews shaped like grapevines. El Cielo sat tucked away behind a sloping ridge of wild olive trees and sun-baked sycamores, the kind of place a GPS would call unmarked road, and locals whispered about like it was some holy ground for aging romantics and forgotten promises. The sign at the entrance was a hand-carved slab of redwood, worn down by salt air and years, and hanging slightly crooked like a man's tired shoulders after a long life. When the three women stepped out of the Highlander, the air smelled like rosemary and crushed lavender, and somewhere in the distance a lone guitar played a melody too sad to be casual. The heat of the afternoon was beginning to slip away, replaced by a golden hush that seemed to stretch across the valley like warm honey. That was when they saw him. Raphael. He stood barefoot at the edge of a row of syrah vines, his white shirt open at the collar and sleeves rolled up, revealing sun-browned arms marked with little nicks and calluses that spoke of labor, not leisure. His hair was a soft gray, but his eyes hadn't aged a day, they held that deep, slow look men get only after heartbreak has taught them to pay attention. Joyce, for reasons she didn't understand at the time and wouldn't admit for weeks after, stepped forward first, smoothing down her blouse with a quick motion that betrayed her nerves. Grace and Martha exchanged a glance that said everything without saying anything at all. Martha raised one eyebrow, and Grace smiled, tight-lipped, as if to say let the widow have her moment. "Welcome to El Cielo," Raphael said, voice low, warm, and slightly accented, just enough to make ordinary words feel like promises whispered through oak barrels. "You're just in time for the last light." "We wouldn't miss it," Joyce replied, and in that moment, something passed between them, soft, unspoken, undeniable. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was a door, cracked open. They followed Raphael down a winding path lined with wine barrels used as planters for basil and thyme, past an old stone well with ivy climbing like it had secrets to protect, and into a small, shaded patio with 3 chairs, a table, and 4 wine glasses already waiting. He poured slowly, explaining the blend, Tempranillo and Zinfandel, aged 6 years, named after his mother, La Espera, which meant, the waiting. Joyce caught the way his fingers lingered on the bottle like it was more than glass and cork, like it was memory. They sipped, and time slowed. This wine, Grace said, swirling it like she'd seen on television but never cared to try before, tastes like the summer my daughter was born. Martha laughed, took a sip, and said, tastes like the first protest I ever got arrested in. Which is to say, fiery, but with purpose. Raphael smiled, and the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened. Then I have done something right. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the vineyard rows, Raphael turned to Joyce and said, almost casually, would you like to see the cellar? Now, Joyce had lived 75 years on this earth, survived a world war, 2 recessions, and a marriage that ended in a hospital room holding a hand she wasn't ready to let go. But in that moment, she felt 17 again, awkward, hopeful, terrified, and nodded. Grace nudged Martha. Should we follow? Martha scoffed. Hell no. She's earned this. The cellar was carved directly into the hill, cool and lit with flickering sconces that cast soft shadows against the stone walls. Rows upon rows of bottles lined the shelves like soldiers standing at quiet attention. Joyce ran her hand along one, feeling the dust, the age, the weight of so many stories. Raphael stopped beside a barrel stamped with the year 1994. My wife died that year, he said, not as a confession but as a truth that had been spoken enough times to lose its sting. She never got to taste this one. I've never opened it. Joyce didn't speak. She knew that grief, the kind that lingers quietly in objects and dates. She knew better than to fill silence when it was doing its sacred work. I think, he said slowly, maybe I've been waiting for someone to share it with. He turned, met her eyes, and something inside her shifted, not like a landslide, but like the first crack in winter ice. Back on the patio, Martha and Grace were finishing their second glass, watching the horizon burn gold. I like him, Martha said finally. He's got that look. What look? Grace asked, feigning indifference while very much listening. The look of a man who's stopped asking permission to be happy. Grace thought about that long after they left, long after Raphael kissed Joyce's hand and promised they'd always be welcome. The drive to the next town was quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because the right words hadn't arrived yet. They checked into a dusty old roadside inn called the Sleepy Peach, a place with flickering neon and beds that creaked like haunted ships. The air conditioning didn't work right, but the clerk offered them free pie, and no one complained. They settled in with sighs and soft grumbles, old bones tired from new adventures. That night, around midnight, a knock came at their door. 3 soft knocks. Not urgent. Not fearful. Just, persistent. Joyce opened it and found an envelope on the floor, no address, no stamp, just her name written in heavy block letters. Inside was a photograph. 3 women. Laughing. Seated at a vineyard. This vineyard. That very afternoon. Taken from a distance. Joyce stared, her heart catching in her throat, because none of them remembered seeing a camera. And in the corner of the photo, barely visible in the shadows behind the vines, was the edge of a man's coat. Not Raphael's. Someone had been watching them. Closely. And whoever it was, had followed them. Joyce didn't sleep that night, not because of the creaking bed springs or the ancient air conditioner that wheezed like a dying elephant, but because of the photograph that now sat on her lap, lit only by the flickering glow of the motel's neon peach sign seeping through the blinds. She stared at it like it might explain itself if she just looked long enough, if she just squinted at the grainy edges where shadows gathered and secrets perched like crows waiting to be named. Grace had stirred only once during the night, mumbling something about lemon bars, and rolling over with the kind of innocent peace that comes only after too much wine and too many memories. Martha, always the light sleeper, had awakened to find Joyce sitting upright with her reading glasses on and the photograph held between 2 careful fingers like a fragile piece of evidence in a courtroom drama. You look like someone just handed you a ghost, Martha said, her voice low, dry, touched with more concern than she let on. Joyce didn't look up. Did you see anyone today, anyone strange? Martha chuckled. We're three old women on a wine bender, every person we meet thinks we're the strange ones. Joyce turned the photo around so Martha could see it clearly. This wasn't taken by Raphael or his staff. Look behind Grace. There's someone in the vines. Martha squinted, adjusted her glasses, then sat up straight. The smirk vanished. That's not right. They sat in silence, the kind born from years of knowing better than to panic. Instead, Martha stood, wrapped herself in the motel's floral print bedspread like a makeshift shawl, and said, "Let's talk to the night clerk." Downstairs, the front desk was manned by a young man with a scruffy beard and the air of someone who'd seen one too many weird guests to be rattled by much. His name tag said Derek, and he was scrolling through his phone when the two women approached. "Everything okay, ladies?" he asked, eyes barely leaving the screen. Joyce placed the photograph gently on the counter, tapping it once like a lawyer presenting an exhibit. "Who took this? And how did they know we were here?" Derek leaned in, frowned, and scratched his head. "I've never seen this before." "Where'd you get it?" "It was slipped under our door," Martha said, folding her arms. "After midnight." Now Derek's eyes narrowed, and he set his phone down. "This place has got no security cameras, but we keep a guest ledger behind the desk. Just in case. You want to see if anything looks off?" He pulled out a large, battered binder, old school, handwritten entries, no computer in sight. Joyce scanned the names, truckers, travelers, a retired couple from Modesto, and then her eyes landed on an entry that made her skin go cold. "Room 9, she said. R. Fields. Checked in yesterday. No checkout date." "That's the room across the hall," Martha muttered. "Did you see anyone go in or out?" Joyce shook her head. "No one. Not once. They went to room 9. They knocked. Nothing. They knocked again, louder. Still nothing." Derek arrived a few minutes later with a master key, looking as nervous as a man asked to open Pandora's box. "I don't usually do this," he muttered. "But something about this whole thing gives me the creeps." The door opened with a reluctant click, revealing a room that looked, at first, perfectly ordinary. The bed was made. The bathroom light hummed softly. But on the small table beneath the window sat a pair of binoculars, a disposable camera, and a notepad. Joyce picked up the notepad with gloved fingers. She didn't know why she suddenly felt the need to be delicate, but something in the room demanded it. The top sheet read only. El Cielo. Widow. Day 2. Grace had just woken up when they returned upstairs, hair tousled and eyes half-lidded with sleep, but when Joyce handed her the note, she snapped awake faster than any amount of caffeine could manage. "Widow," she read aloud. "They're watching you." Martha, still holding the camera wrapped in a towel, added, "Or they think they are." Which begs the question, why? They called the local sheriff's office that morning, but the deputy who showed up was the same one who defused the cowboy situation 2 days earlier. He took their report politely, glanced at the notepad and the photo, and said he'd file it, which in small-town parlance usually meant, put it somewhere and forget it existed. "I wouldn't worry too much," he said with a shrug. "Could be some harmless weirdo. Happens all the time when out-of-towners come through." "Do harmless weirdos leave surveillance notes?" Grace asked, her voice dry as toast left in the sun. The deputy offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's a strange world, ma'am." They left the Sleepy Peach shortly after that, all three of them unsettled but too proud to say the word scared. The photo, the note, and the camera went into Joyce's purse, zipped up tight like secrets waiting for a day that might never come. The next stop on their tour was supposed to be Santa Ynez, rolling hills, soft Chardonnay, a bed and breakfast shaped like a windmill, but the mood had shifted. The laughter came less easily. Conversations wandered toward half-sentences and unspoken thoughts. It was Grace who finally cracked it open. As they pulled into a quiet rest stop with no one around but a few weary travelers and a vending machine that ate dollar bills without shame, she said, "I don't think this is about us." Martha turned. "It's literally about us. They called Joyce the widow. They followed our car." Grace shook her head. "No. That note, it wasn't from someone who wants to hurt us. It was someone who wants us to know something." Joyce stared out the window at the wide California sky, as blue and endless as her thoughts. "Then the question is, what?" They reached Santa Ynez just as the light was fading again, that same burnished glow that made the hills look dipped in candle wax. The B&B was empty except for them, and the host, a wiry man with a limp and a kind smile, offered to show them to their rooms personally. "Most people cancel last minute," he said with a shrug. "Wine country ain't what it used to be." Over dinner, a roast chicken so tender it fell apart under the weight of its own seasoning, Joyce found a small envelope tucked under her plate. Her name again. This time, the note was shorter, neater, but somehow more chilling. "Do not trust the man from El Cielo." And as she read it, somewhere far off in the night, a glass shattered. Joyce stared at the note beneath her dinner plate the way a person stares at the last page of a mystery novel, knowing the ending had arrived too early, before the pieces made sense, before the story had earned its conclusion. She didn't say anything at first, not because she was afraid, but because there are moments in a woman's life, especially in the long, quiet winter of it, where silence is the only reasonable reply to something that shakes you down to the bones. Grace, always more curious than cautious, leaned over with a frown deep enough to hold a lifetime's worth of disappointment. "What is it now?" she asked, her voice hushed but sharp, like a broom sweeping up broken trust. Joyce slid the paper across the table. Martha read it once, twice, then pushed back her chair with the kind of controlled tension that only comes from years of speaking truth to power without ever raising her voice. "Someone's playing a game," she said. "And I don't like games unless I'm winning." None of them touched the roast chicken after that. It sat on the table like a prop in a play that had changed scripts mid-scene. They each took a glass of wine back to their rooms, the clinking of glass against stemware sounding more like a warning than a toast. Joyce waited until the house was quiet, until the host had turned off the porch lights and the wind had settled into a soft rustle outside her window, before she reached into her suitcase for the photo again. She studied the background now, not just the three of them smiling like nothing could touch them, but the space behind the laughter. There was something in that photograph she hadn't seen before, some small blur in the shadows that looked too deliberate to be accidental. She reached for her reading glasses, adjusted the angle of the bedside lamp, and brought the photo close. The figure in the corner wasn't just a man in a coat, it was a woman. Blurry, yes, and partially obscured by the vines, but unmistakably female, the curve of the shoulder, the long hair swept back in a loose bun, the posture of someone who didn't expect to be seen. Joyce felt the breath catch in her chest, not from fear, but from recognition. She didn't know the woman, not in the way one knows a neighbor or an old friend, but there was something about the silhouette, something in the way she stood, like a ghost remembering how to take up space. The next morning, she showed the others. "That's not Raphael," she said, tapping the corner of the image. "That's someone else." Grace blinked at the photo, then turned it sideways like the answer might fall out. "Could be someone from his vineyard crew. Maybe just passing by." "No," Martha said, pointing at the outline of the bun. "Whoever this is, she wanted to be seen. Not clearly. Just enough." They made one decision before breakfast: return to El Cielo. No more detours. No more tastings or sunsets or casual meanderings through charming little towns filled with distractions and scented soaps. There was a thread running through this whole trip now, something that had been pulling them quietly from the beginning, and they were finally ready to follow it. The drive back to the vineyard took longer than expected, not because of traffic, but because Joyce stopped twice to collect herself. Once at a roadside fruit stand where she bought plums and didn't eat them, and once outside a tiny chapel that had a bell tower and no congregation. "I don't know what I'm walking into," she said softly, almost to herself. Martha squeezed her shoulder with a tenderness that only lifelong friendship allows. Whatever it is, we walk in together. When they arrived at El Cielo, it was quieter than before. The vines looked the same, tidy rows basking in the sunlight, but the place had a stillness that felt less like peace and more like waiting. Raphael appeared moments later, just as he had the first time, calm, warm, sleeves rolled, eyes steady. But something in his face had shifted, not a full expression, just a flicker behind the kindness, like a curtain tugged ever so slightly. Joyce didn't bother with small talk. "I need to ask you something," she said, holding the photo like a relic. "Who is she?" Raphael looked at the photo, his gaze resting not on the women in the foreground but the shadowed figure in the back. For a moment, the mask slipped. He stepped back. "You weren't supposed to see her." Grace let out a low whistle, the sound a cross between amusement and concern. "Oh, that's a hell of a sentence." Raphael looked at Joyce, then past her, out at the hills where the vines ended and the wild fields began. "She was my sister," he said finally. "But she's gone now." Joyce stared at him, waiting for more. "She died here," he continued, voice lower. 8 years ago. Fell during the harvest. Some say it was an accident. Others have theories." Martha didn't blink. "And what do you believe?" "I believe grief makes liars of all of us," he said. "Sometimes even to ourselves." Grace crossed her arms. "So why has someone been following us? Leaving notes? Photos? What does your sister have to do with us?" Raphael met Joyce's eyes and gave the saddest smile she'd ever seen. "Because you look just like her." The words hit like a thunderclap wrapped in silence. Joyce stepped back, breath caught in her throat. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I never knew your family." He nodded. "And yet." He led them to the old cellar again, the cool air and stone walls now heavy with something far older than wine. He showed them a photograph in a frame, dusty, cracked, the image faded with time. It was a group of workers, all smiles and sunburns, holding a bottle of Tempranillo like it was a trophy. In the center stood Raphael. And beside him, arm around his waist, stood a woman who looked almost exactly like Joyce. Younger, yes. But unmistakable. Same eyes. Same shape of face. Even the same small scar on the right side of the jaw, something Joyce had gotten from a childhood bicycle accident on a gravel road in Iowa. "That's not possible," Joyce whispered. "That is me." But she'd never been here before. Had she? Martha and Grace were silent now, watching her, waiting for something unspoken to rise to the surface. Raphael placed a hand on her shoulder. "There are things we don't remember," he said gently. "And there are things we're not meant to remember until they matter most." Joyce's knees buckled slightly, and she sat down hard on a nearby bench. Memories, faint, scattered, dreamlike, began to shimmer just beneath her thoughts, like glimpses through rippling water. A summer. A man. A vineyard. Laughter and dancing and a bottle of wine that tasted like home. Something long before her marriage. Something she'd buried so deep, not even her grief could find it. A truth was beginning to rise. But it wasn't ready yet. And neither was she. Outside, the sun was beginning to set again, lighting the hills with that same golden hush that had greeted them days ago. But now the light felt different. Not peaceful. Ominous. They were no longer tourists on a wine tour. They were characters in someone else's unfinished story. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of the vineyard, the woman in the photograph was still waiting. Joyce hadn't spoken for several minutes after seeing the photograph, hadn't blinked, hadn't breathed in the usual way, as if her lungs were now being told a different truth than the one they'd lived with for 75 years. She sat there on that stone bench like a woman watching a home movie from someone else's life but realizing, frame by frame, that every face, every laugh, every glass raised under the sun, somehow belonged to her too. Grace didn't touch her, she knew better. When a friend is unraveling a memory this deeply buried, sometimes the most sacred thing you can offer is stillness. Martha, however, paced. That was her way. When logic broke, her feet did the talking. She muttered things under her breath, mostly names, dates, questions without punctuation. Raphael, ever the portrait of quiet patience, sat beside Joyce with that same aged calm, as though he'd been waiting not 5 minutes but 5 decades for her to remember something she'd left here before she ever married, before she ever called herself a realtor, before she ever took on the name of a man who had never truly seen her for who she was. I was 17, Joyce said finally, her voice a whisper soaked in stunned reverence. No, 18. Just barely. My parents had sent me away after that summer in Bakersfield when things got complicated. There was this family friend who knew someone in the valley, and they said I could work the fields, make a little money, disappear for a while until everything blew over. Raphael listened without interruption. Joyce reached for the photograph again, her hand trembling, not from fear, but from the way truth shakes the bones when it's been waiting too long to be named. That was the summer of the fire, she said slowly, her voice finding rhythm again. I remember the smell of smoke, the helicopters. I remember picking grapes in the morning and dancing at night in the barn with music from someone's radio. And I remember. She paused, turning to Raphael. You, she said, not as a question, but as a rediscovery. You were there. You were younger, of course. So was I. Raphael nodded, and the silence that followed was not empty but filled with the heaviness of time folding back onto itself. We were more than friends, Joyce said quietly, and the words sounded like they'd waited their entire lives to be spoken. But when the fire came, I was sent home. No goodbyes. Just a train ticket and a warning to forget. Martha stopped pacing. Why would someone go to all this trouble to make you remember? Raphael stood and walked to the far end of the cellar where a narrow wooden drawer was tucked beneath a dusty workbench. He pulled out a small box, worn smooth with age. From it, he removed a bundle of letters, yellowed, fragile, tied with twine. These were hers, he said, placing them gently in Joyce's lap. My sister never gave up on finding you. She said you were the missing piece, the thing left unfinished. She never believed you'd vanished on your own terms. She believed someone took you away from her life for a reason. Joyce untied the string with trembling fingers, unfolding one letter at random. The handwriting was neat, careful, filled with stories, about the vineyard, about Raphael, about a child who never came. The last line of one letter, written in a hurried scrawl, caught her eye. I think she was pregnant. But no one ever talked about it again. The words hit like a stone dropped in a still pond. Joyce gasped. Grace leaned in. Joyce. I was, she whispered. Just barely. But my mother, she never let me speak of it. She arranged everything. Doctors. A home for girls. I never saw the baby. They told me it was handled. Martha stepped forward slowly, the color draining from her face. Joyce, if that's true. Raphael opened the box again and took out one final object, a photograph of a young man, tall, dark hair, serious eyes, standing in front of El Cielo, holding a bottle of La Espera. My nephew, Raphael said softly. His name is Daniel. He came back here 2 years ago. Said he wanted to understand where he came from. I thought he meant the land. The grapes. But now. Joyce took the photo in her hands, staring into the face of a boy who looked nothing like her husband, and everything like her past. I never knew, she said, tears rising without shame. I never knew what they did. I never even asked. He found the letters, Raphael said. My sister kept them all. Her words became his map. That's how he found me. That's how he found this place. And I think, He paused, looking out the cellar window toward the vineyard. I think he found you, too. Grace sat heavily on a crate, her usual sarcasm nowhere to be found. You mean to tell me we've been chased by your son this entire time? Not chased, Martha said, her voice thick with awe. Called. They returned to the inn that evening in stunned silence, the sunset burning around them like a second birth. Joyce sat by the window with a glass of wine untouched in her hand, staring out at the hills. The next morning, as the fog began to lift and the road beckoned once more, a note was waiting for her in the front seat of the Highlander. No envelope. Just a single line, handwritten. I think I'm ready to meet you, Mom. D. Joyce didn't cry. Not because she wasn't moved, but because sometimes tears aren't enough for what the soul is trying to release. Instead, she handed the note to Grace, looked at Martha, and smiled in that way only a woman who survived everything and then some can smile. Well, she said, fastening her seatbelt with purpose. Let's go see who I raised. And as the Highlander pulled back onto the road, the vineyards rolled out before them like open arms. Not a tour. Not a detour. But a return. Write in the comments where you're from, let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.